Good evening, and welcome to Tabletop Bob. Today's October 19th. We're right in the middle of spooky season, so I thought it's fitting that we talk about horror in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Welcome back. This channel is devoted to Dungeons & Dragons content, including live plays every week. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss another video. Currently, we have a group playing the Icewind Dale Rime of the Frostmaiden campaign, and this Sunday, October 25th, we have a new group starting up called Supernatural 20. Every session will be its own individual adventure, so you can follow along, watch these videos, and then run them at your table. The first adventure is going to be The Mask of the Worms by the Arcane Library. I plan on doing a DM prep video and guide to go along with the kickoff of this campaign. And stick around to the end of the video because I'm going to talk about how you could win yourself a pair of vampire dice. Now, for those of you who don't know, I'm a really big horror fan, especially horror films in general. But there's a lot of people out there that believe that Dungeons & Dragons and horror don't mix. The main argument is that when you're running a horror-themed game in Dungeons & Dragons, horror is predicated on fear. And most of the characters that we make are heroic, in fact, super heroic. All the characters in a horror movie franchise generally are scared of the creature, the monster, the killer. You don't really see too many heroes or protagonists fighting back using spells or superpowers. They're not high-powered wizards, clerics, and paladins using arcane and divine magic. Therefore, most people believe that Dungeons & Dragons doesn't really fit with horror because the characters just simply wouldn't be scared of the supposedly horrifying things that they encounter. Another issue with D&D is that the mechanics of the game really don't lend itself to the horror theme. As the characters level up and gain more abilities and powers, they do seem as though they would be invincible. Most horror games and campaigns take place at lower levels just for this reason. Now, I hear where these critics are coming from, but I wholeheartedly disagree. While there may be other games out there that do the horror theme better, like Call of Cthulhu, I do think that D&D actually does work well with the horror setting. When I first started playing D&D, I looked at all of the covers of the boxes and books, and I pretty much saw a horror game played out in front of me, going into dark and scary dungeons, fighting monsters. Yeah, I know that my characters were going to be brave enough to venture into those places, but ultimately, the threat of death was real. And a lot of old school D&D players will tell you that the game was more deadly back in the day. If this isn't horror, then I don't know what is. And I think the best example of horror in Dungeons & Dragons would be Curse of Strahd. Now, without a doubt, Curse of Strahd is the most successful game in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but it's one of the most beloved of all time. There are actually a lot of reasons why Strahd works so well as a horror setting in Dungeons & Dragons. The first is primarily that it is a fantastic story. It's classic Dracula meets Dungeons & Dragons. It has nostalgia. And finally, it's written in a way that helps the Dungeon Master run it to implement horror elements and make the characters who are powerful truly afraid of Strahd and his dark forces. So with that being said, I've done a lot of thinking and planning for my new horror campaign, and I feel like I have a couple of tips and tricks that you can use at your table to implement this horror theme. The first thing that I think you need to do is set your players' expectations. I had a pre-campaign meeting with my players, this is even before a session 0, where we basically discussed the horror theme and what the players should expect. Since horror involves fear, I told all my characters to keep that in mind when making their characters. It's not so much that their characters can't be brave, but they have to be able to buy into the horror factor. Sometimes it's okay for characters to be role-played as scared or fearful of something. In reality, those characters would be more realistic. It'd also be cool to give your character in a horror campaign certain flaws, some phobias. You could probably think of things from film and literature that you've seen before. You know, fear of rats, snakes, spiders, perhaps fear of the undead. Or maybe the character has had run-ins with certain types of creatures like werewolves or vampires, and perhaps that's tied into their background. And I just want to clarify, it is okay to play a brave character. In fact, it's almost necessary for a character to be brave in some way, because otherwise, why would they go on these scary adventures? Why would they enter into these haunted houses or creepy castles if they were scared? If you're looking for an example of a brave to coward scale, then look no further than Scooby-Doo. Shaggy and Scooby don't want to solve these mysteries, but the rest of the gang is always willing, and they often convince Shag and Scoob to push out of their comfort zones. Ultimately, they always go on the adventure. So really what I'm trying to get at is just get your players on board, have them buy into the fear factor, and make sure that they're playing characters that would react realistically. My next tip would be to choose your locations carefully. If you're designing your own horror adventure, try to pick a location that is small in scale and usually pretty confined or isolated. It might be a good idea to start with your final location when you're planning the adventure. The best horror stories all take place in a small, confined space. They take place in haunted houses, cabins in the woods, spaceships, or polar science stations. Tight quarters, where there's nowhere to run, are easily adapted to the D&D combat and exploration system, especially in one-shots that you intend to finish in one setting. Additionally, if the location is rather remote, it might be even better because the players will feel more trapped and alone. There's always less tension if the characters could simply go back to town, regroup, gather supplies, maybe even reinforcements, and then head back to the haunted house. Something that cannot be overstated enough is to build suspense. Well, what is suspense? I think I'm going to let the expert take this one on.
There's a great confusion between the words mystery and suspense. And the two things are absolutely miles apart. You see, mystery is an intellectual process, like in a whodunit. But suspense is essentially an emotional process. Therefore, you can only get the suspense element going by giving the audience information. And I dare say you've seen many films which have mysterious goings on. You don't know what's going, why the man is doing this, why that, and you're about a third of the way through the film before you realize what it's all about. And to me, that's completely wasted footage because there's no emotion to it.
What Alfred Hitchcock is talking about in that clip is really about giving your players enough information for them to feel the tension, to feel the suspense. It's an emotional thing. You can't feel suspense if you don't know something is coming. There's nothing scary about a surprise attack or a jump scare from a monster. Once the combat starts, all that tension is released. In fact, in tabletop RPGs, I think most of the tension goes away when you have a combat because you either put a figure onto the table or a token to represent the monster, and it's really not the same as what you can build in your imagination. You want to keep the monster hidden so that the characters don't ever really get to see it until the very end. But you should definitely foreshadow its presence. You can do this by showing previous victims that they find, dead bodies. You can also analyze bite wounds, puncture marks, have the players hypothesize about what may have killed these characters. Holding the monster until the end will allow the players' imaginations to run wild. If you show the monster too soon, they won't be scared of it during the final encounter. There is one exception to this rule. If you're running a longer campaign like Curse of Strahd, then it's actually quite fun and scary to encounter the villain early and often. One of the biggest advantages of the module is that Strahd appears many times throughout the game and could kill the party on a whim. He's overly confident and doesn't perceive the party as a threat, so he plays with his food. He does this countless times before the finale. Once you do get to the finale of your adventure or the module you're running or your campaign, you need to reveal your big bad monster and it needs to be big and bad. This should be a deadly encounter with a chance of multiple players getting knocked out. I'm not saying player death should be a goal, but it should be on the table at all times. In fact, if the characters at all during the final battle feel like it's too easy, you kind of lose all of the tension you've built up. There's nothing scary about destroying the evil villain in one round. Obviously, Dungeons and Dragons is a game where dungeon masters always take inspiration from film and literature. In fact, many of the campaigns that are run by wizards take movies and literature as their inspiration. Look at Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden. Chris Perkins said that this adventure was inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, John Carpenter's The Thing, as well as even Jaws. So, if they can take inspiration from their favorite movies and books, you can too. Take a situation from a favorite movie and find a way to adapt it into the D&D world. All right, now for the giveaway. On my stream on October 25th, when we start our campaign, we're going to be giving away a set of dice from the Etsy store, Twice as Nice Dice. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures of them so you can really get some high detailed images of what these dice look like. First off, they are beautiful. These dice have the right feel. They're nice and crisp with sharp edges, so the dice don't wobble when you roll them. They're beautifully crafted with nasty blood effect in the middle. Perfect for the horror fan in your life. Links are in the description. Please check out their shop. I'm going to draw a random subscriber of mine, so if you want to be a part of this giveaway, make sure you hit the subscribe button. I'll contact the winner directly so we can figure out how to get the dice to them. All right, well, that's all I've got for horror and D&D. Stay tuned and look out for my next video where I talk about madness and sanity rules and how I use them in my games. I'll see you all on the tabletop. Bye.